We've seen over the past couple of weeks two tragic murders, and from the police's perspective, we obviously respond, we have the investigation, we do a considerable amount of work in family liaison and trying to reassure communities. But the thing is, I then take time to sort of sit back and say, well, what could we have done differently? And I think a lot of the things that perhaps people don't appreciate, I'm sure you do, is the amount of things we actually prevent. And we do a considerable amount of work with intelligence, and we stop violent crime taking place. So there's a huge effort by the Bermuda Police Service in that regard. But the thing for me is that I think we've got lots of people doing lots of things, but sometimes the worry is that perhaps it's not as joined up as it could be.
Sure.
And at the heart of this are local communities, people who live in particular areas, and the support, the advice, and the things that they can do to change some of the things. And I realise there's no overnight solutions, but the problems that we face are heavily embedded. Quite often they manifest over years and years of a young person growing up into being a teenager and becoming part of a gang. And I don't know what your views are in regards to what needs to be done and how things could be done differently.
Sure. Well, let's look at the last two, shootings. What happens from our perspective as community activists, and our focus is basically on the children and the families. So, we would get the call. Basically, we can't even begin to do our outreach and our connect to the children without the police, because many of those environments are still very much unsafe. We don't know what we're walking into. The police provide us that doorway to go in and provide the help and support to the families, whether it's through counseling, through other resources. So, we have to we are very grateful that, there's a police presence and a police process that guides us through what we do. I think some of the things, when I first started, I think my very first call out was Shonday Jones, probably close to 20 years ago. There wasn't a police liaison officer at the time because it was all new to Bermuda. That police liaison officer provides the families with resources, with support, with information that are separate from the investigation, separate from the work that the medical people are doing. And so we look forward to developing a closer and closer relationship with all of those entities, because at the end of the day, you're dealing with a community who is, there's a lot of fear, there's a lot of people who really don't know what to do, where to go, and how to address. Imagine looking out of your window, one of the neighborhoods, which is a very closely linked neighborhood. You can look out your window and there's like 5 houses to your left and 5 houses to your right. So there's a person lying there in the ground, dead. And babies, children, adults, everybody is looking at this scene at the same time. And most people just don't know what to do with it. And so we encourage the community, leading up to this. Like, we know our neighborhoods. We know the guys that, are selling drugs are there every day. The people that are caught up in certain lifestyles are there all the time, We can't expect any one group of people to do all the work. I know it's difficult. I live Frizzles Hill, gunshots, gun shootings, it's something that happens quite often in my community. So I'm not removed from it as well. But, it's, I think the challenge that we have as a community at this point is that a lot of the way that it was being done in the initial stages has shifted. For an example, a lot of those who are committing the crimes and the ones who are dying from the shootings are younger. When I first started, you were talking about late 30s, early 40s, some of those who were being convicted. We're now in the 30s, and in some cases, 20-year-olds. The other thing is that, before it was happening in dark, isolated areas. Now they're happening on our front steps.
Yeah.
So these are shifts that I think would cause any community to become fearful. I do believe a lot of education needs to be done on the grassroots level. of people understanding what actually happens. For an example, sometimes we are deployed to the community area where the incident may have taken place. Sometimes we're deployed to the hospital, and sometimes we're deployed to the person's house. So depending on where Pastor Bean, who is the person who would call us as part of the emergency response team, sends us, we have to prepare for where we're going and how we're going to help. You know?
My perspective, and the police perspective, the reality of what we deal with is often around high risk and threats, and again, to my point I said before, a lot of the public don't see a lot of the work that we do covertly, and we have a lot of intelligence that comes in. It's a bit like an iceberg where you can see the bits on the top, but all the stuff underneath that's going on. And I'm adamant that one of the critical problems we've got is that the resulting violence is because of access to firearms. And I'm not saying that's the total solution, but the more guns that we can take away from, or certainly access to guns that we can take away from gangs, has a direct impact on reducing the likelihood of murders and other shootings. And we recovered 3 firearms a few weeks ago, which you'll be aware of, and that's a massive benefit, not least because I genuinely believe those firearms have been used in murders over the past sort of 10 or 15 years, and hopefully it'll identify and bring justice to some families. But there are still guns out there, so a lot of the work that we're trying to do is to reduce that risk. But the point you raise is, I totally agree with, and this is where I think the effort needs to come, because my perspective is if you grow up in that community, it's more likely than not, if you're a young person, that perhaps you're not going to get the best education, you're maybe not going to be able to access the best opportunities, and maybe you're not going to be able to access good employment, and recognising Bermuda is an expensive place to live. So the attraction of being involved in drug dealing and the attraction of being involved in gangs is extremely strong for a young person. And I think sometimes we fail to recognise that actually, if I want to live here, if I want to look after my family, if I want to feel part of a group, I'm going to sell drugs. And I think some of the kind of root causes about enforcement and stuff like that control the problem, but they don't solve the problem.
Very true.
And the things that I'm really keen on, and certainly experience I've had working in the UK, is what's a diversion that we can do for a young person, particularly when they're, 8, 9 years old. We recognise that perhaps in a high-risk area, how do we educate them well, guide them, but how do, when they get into the kind of 12, 13, 14 years, that maybe we give them more opportunity than other kids and say, well, actually, you can go to a good school. We'll put you in a good school where you can get a great education, and we'll give you a mentor, and we'll give you a coach. So it guides you away from perhaps the problem that you could fall into. And I think those are perhaps some of the more difficult and unfortunately expensive decisions that we need to start making.
Well, I look at it from a very simplistic perspective. Well, we pay $90,000-$80,000 per year per inmate. That's what it costs to have a person incarcerated in our prisons. Education in public schools is between $20,000 and $22,000. So the question is, do we want to make the investment on the front end, or do we want to make the investment on the back end? Because if you're living in an environment where you can clearly see the gang culture, growing and growing, where you know that a lot of these kids don't have access to the best of resources or even family support, it's almost inevitable. And yes, I agree. We know these neighborhoods. We know we could actually. I was actually looking at a story from the Gazette, maybe from 6 years ago, and they mapped all of the shootings, all of the killings, the locations, and the persons. And of course, Pembroke, hands down, had the majority. So why not? When you see that that's data, that's information, that in some jurisdictions it's so big and so vast, you can go in and kind of identify specifically. And so I do believe that those are some of the types of approaches we can take. I say, the good and not so good opportunity as an activist to work on both sides of the fence. So I'm sitting at the feet of a parent who has a 2-year-old whose father, has been lost to gun violence, and now has gone from a 2 paycheck home to one. So that Friday, that parent's rent is going to be the same, but her income isn't going to be the same. That other parent's support in taking the child to school or whatever that other parent, that's gone. So you've now become very vulnerable as a parent. On top of all of that, you're dealing with the death. You're dealing with a $10,000 cost for a funeral. You're dealing with all of these dynamics. And the children, the ones who don't have a voice to say, this is how it's impacting me, stand in the midst of it all. I do believe that there are many ways that we are helping. There are lots of people who will never be on the front page of the paper or are known that do great work, that reach out. I was at one incident where the community went into high action. They started to bring food. One lady took the children out of the environment to her home. So there are communities that come together and rally together, during the height of some of these incidents. I think our challenge when we talk about education is that, when I spent a lot of time with the gang members. I worked as a street worker, community street worker for 2 years and lived in their space, worked in their space, and got very close to them in the way they think and the way they move and the way they operate. And that they're human, they're just like you and I, and they said, they would say stuff, okay, Miss Spence, if I give up this lifestyle, if you take this out of my hand, okay, where am I going to work?
What's the alternative?
I can give you the guns, I can give you the drugs, then tomorrow, how do I eat?
Yeah.
And those are the real questions and concerns. Is there a true program of transitioning, out of this life into a place of opportunity?
I was doing some reading. I made contact with a group in the UK the other day called Divert, and they're a community activist-based group. And what they do, particularly around gangs, is they call them opportunity moments, and it tends to be when they're in custody. And they reach out to gang members and have identical conversations to the ones you described, which is, I want to give up, but what's my alternative? But what they do is they do a lot of work to offer the alternative. So they look at accommodation, quite often taking them out of the environment in which they're vulnerable, so away from maybe, and I know Bermuda's not big, but small changes can be done. But they also have a number of employers that sponsor and are willing to work community initiatives, and they'll take them on. And okay, there's rules. They do even things like drug testing and get them to sign up to a behaviour contract. But actually the success rate is really high because that person then starts having some money in his pocket, a bit of self-esteem and pride, and then perhaps learns a trade and craft. And I think for me, that's where the gaps are, because if you're going to make intervention and diversion, you've got to have that alternative, which is, we want you to put down the gun, we want you to put down the drugs, but actually this is the deal we're offering to you. And I think the point you made, which I think is a really important point, whilst it's expensive, it's more economical to invest in prevention than it is in dealing with the consequence.
Yeah.
And the cost of us even investigating a murder is
how many educational scholarships,
tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars. But the cost to a family who's lost a loved one is a lifetime payment.
Yeah.
So I think, and we work very well with government. We've got great leadership, certainly from the Minister's point of view and his effort and commitment. But I sometimes wonder if we're dealing with stuff after the horse has bolted, as opposed to perhaps locking the stable door first and saying what are the things that we need to do when these kids are young, but when actually in problem areas, what does it look like to lead that person out of their environment of risk and put them in a safe place and also give them some direction in life.
And that's what we offer, like the training that we've had. We work with a group called Comfort Zone. They provide the largest bereavement camp in the world for children. And obviously there are 5 stages of grief that most people will go through at some point in time of death, whether you're an adult or a child. And when you're looking at those 5 stages, isolation, anger, confusion, denial, and then acceptance, you're talking to a person about those stages. On the flip side of that, you're talking to the guys who are pulling the triggers, they're isolated, they're angry. So you can kind of take a pencil and say if these kids don't get the correct support and the right programs put in place, then just by default, they could possibly end up on this side because they're telling you how they ended up in this way. Their isolation could be because the father wasn't there, meaning the father could have just left the mom or something could have happened in the relationship. Then a person is doing life in our prisons and a person is 6 feet under the ground. The void is the same. The parent is not there. So the child grows up without the second parent. We know that the majority of the children that we've serviced over the last 10, 12 years have been under the age of 10. Few 13, 14, but the majority were either in their mother's wombs or very young when their fathers got shot. So for an example, if my son shot your son 8 years ago and they were both 10 and they're now entering into the work environment or a learning environment, who would know? Who would know? We only have 2 high schools, probably. Who is going to determine now? The kids, the two boys are going to know. But will the principal know that entering her classroom this semester are 2 kids whose fathers, one took the other's life? It's just human nature to want to know who did it. And in my talks with former or reform gang members from the Crips and the Bloods, that's the school environment is the breeding ground.
Do you think there's any links to the lack of sort of positive male role models that some kids have? Because as you say, I don't know, fathers can be sent to prison or at worst dead. So you have young kids growing up without a positive male role model. Do you think?
It plays a huge role. I mean, in our work with the prisons and prisoners, I mean, we have that data in many reports that have come from the prisons. That has been a common thread for many men and women. And, the women play a role in this as well. And so at the end of the day, mentorship, having one of the things that we ask the parent is, okay, so what is little Johnny or little Sue involved with? Is it ballet? Is it cricket? Is it football? Because most times when they take this loss and the finances dry up, they start to remove them from the actual curriculum. Because the number one thing now is food, shelter, and you know what I mean? So if the only place that little boy felt comfortable was on the football field, but he can no longer engage because there's no money for boots, there's no money for to be involved, then he becomes further isolated or she becomes further isolated. So we try to keep those things on the table.
I mean, the reason why I mention it is I agree with you on sport. I think it's worth talking about that. But I remember reading something around, and it was in a school environment, and they had a couple of young boys, they were about 12, 13, and really problematic at school, sometimes not turning up, and when they were in, they were causing problems. And the profile of them came from broken families, fathers were in prison. But what was happening is that the people teaching them were actually, it's not a gender issue, but that they were women, and they changed their teachers to very strong male, almost role models. And actually their behaviour changed in regards to how they were dealt with, because they had a firm but fair approach around, and there was guidance around their behaviour, and they improved. And I wonder, and I agree with you on that thing around mentorship, and perhaps some people in Bermuda society that can volunteer to maybe assist families and get involved with them, and give them that kind of positive role model and support, and almost like be a foster parent to them and work with that family. I think
in some instances, we've seen that. We've seen football teams rally around a kid. We've seen churches rally around a child. We've seen individuals, step in and take on the responsibility of further mentoring. What we find in Bermuda is the people who immediately step in are mostly the grandparents, because the surviving parent is the mother. So most likely it's going to be her parents and their parents that take on the brunt of getting the children to nursery, helping with the cost of school clothes, all of the basic needs of that family, because it's very expensive to live in Bermuda and to raise children. So again, the people who rally around them and become the next group of, like, they've raised their son and daughter, now they're raising their grandchildren or their great-great-grandchildren. It's a lot of pressure on families. It's a lot of pressure. We have seen people go into debt because they had to come up with the money for the funeral.
Give me some advice, because one of the things that we often find is that the problems with gangs is about territory and turf. So we'll have different gangs on certain parts of the island, and one will fall over another. It might have been, I don't know, selling drugs in a patch or going into a certain location. So we know there's tension, and we start getting intelligence around there's a threat between one gang and another. So we'll police that, and we'll try and arrest people, or we're trying to intervene. But what else could we do as a police to maybe, and it's difficult to go up to a gang and say calm down, but how do we reduce that tension between gangs?
Well, unless you have a relationship of some sort, or someone that they trust, because it's all about trust, it's very difficult to go in, even with good intentions, and try to give support. There's definitely a line drawn between police and persons involved in the use and selling of drugs. And so that's another area where, when we go into an environment, when we're called in, if there's a shooting, like, we come in and we assess the area. So, because we're street workers, we know who's doing what, we know which groups come from where. We have the trust and what we call the street credit to go over to a guy and say, yo, listen, I hear you saying you want revenge, I hear you saying you want to do this and you want to do that. Is it worth it,
Do you think sometimes the police don't share enough information with people like you and other community workers?
I mean, I have a fairly good relationship with your media relations persons, but I don't know about other people. I also think that, I've had a few incidents in the field, in the thick of it, where I would call Mr. Keynes and express my concerns if it's something that I feel could have been done better. I would always, even when I do press releases and I'm talking to the press, I would say, listen, I'm about to speak. Perhaps you want to give me, this is what I'm talking about. Where are you guys at? Is there any information you can give me? So when I'm talking to the press, I'm talking from a place of some sort of information. A lot of times people are talking on emotion. They don't have data. They haven't spoken to the powers that be or the people involved. And I think that causes a deeper divide between the police and the community. I do believe that the police have come a long way, because I remember when there was, like, just unimaginable tension, because people wanted answers. They wanted the police to fix it, and they wanted the police to fix it now. And at that time, during that process, we were all learning. Bermuda didn't know what to do with homicide. It has changed the way we teach, the way people went to a game on Saturday in Somerset.
I went as well. It was good.
Every car was stopped. There was a time in Bermuda where you could go to a game anywhere, and that was police presence. That wasn't.
Because I went to the game on Saturday, and I went in plain clothes. I wasn't wearing a uniform. Went to see. We had a lot of police officers there. But I found it fascinating to go around, and there were a lot of gang guys there, and you sort of, and you can see the social aspect of being in a gang.
Yeah.
You got the girls there, you got guys there, you got them enjoying a drink and all stuff like that. And I get that, because I get the social side. The issue is how to tackle the violence, and the point I do want to raise with you is, and it's not the best term, but how do we address, like, a wall of silence often exists in communities. We've got a guy which has been well publicised. We've got a guy we're seeking at the moment in regards to the murder at St David's at the weekend, and he knows who he is. His family knows who he is, and a lot of people know that he's being sought. And equally, I believe a lot of people know where he is, or are certainly helping him to hide for a period. My concern is that clearly we've got an investigation, but equally I've got a duty of care to him in regards to protecting him. So how do I break that barrier where perhaps the communities have got some trust in the police to say, well, actually, I know where he is and he's here?
It's a tough one. I'm not going to lie, because I do believe that when people go into protection mode, they don't see you necessarily as the person that they want to share that truth with. Mm-hmm. And if it's a parent, they're protecting their child, gang member or not. This is my son. You know, if they're a group of community people or a group of gang members, it's up to them. They look at it as family. We see them as gang members in groups. If you ask them, they say, that's my family. So the question would be, if someone was coming after your son, what would you do? How would you handle it? You know, either knowing that they're not involved, but if they're found, they too could be killed.
Yeah. It's a difficult one, because the point,
it is.
and we raise it publicly, is it's not just the fact that we want to ask questions of an individual, it's the fact that we want to ensure their safety. So
yeah.
And maybe everybody's different, but my view, if it was one of my children, is I'd want them to be safe.
Yeah. But you're on the heels of a murder. And people are still in that mix, you know, and human nature says, I want to protect my child, you know. Are the police going to really be able to keep him safe or keep her safe from this person who has already shown that they're callous, they're cruel, they will take a life, come what may. And I think we wrestle with a lot of that, because, you know, even when we're at the hospital, and, you know, that has changed a bit, because before the hospital, outside of the hospital, just used to be tons of people. That has changed, that has shifted a lot from what I saw in the beginning. It's a lot different, like when a person gets shot and there's some hope. So if a person's on life support, you're still hoping, you know, but if a person is shot and dead immediately, you're dealing with the reality. And all of these kind of dictate how people are going to react or not react to what is happening. And the individuals, you know, there are certain individuals that carry a huge amount of support and respect in their communities. As persons involved in drugs, you know, they on the right course for a football game, they give back to the communities. We may look at it and say, oh, that's crazy, but they do. And so they see that person as a person who helps in spite of the lifestyle that they live. So it's a very fine line, you know, between what we know is the law and what we know is our reality in a community. And I find that we don't often have the honest conversation. You know, some of the most painful conversations that I have at times is, you know, you're asking an individual, okay, you know, we know you love your loved one, you know, we know they're gone, so how can we help you deal with this? And you're asking, so what type of work did they do? You know, what were their, you know, pastimes? They don't have a job, but there's a big car in the back that, you know, you can see that they're surviving somehow. Yeah. It's a painful conversation. It is.
I mean, probably a way of, we could talk for days, but conscious of time and maybe like the kind of what next thing. Do you think that there's a gang violence reduction strategy? There's a lot of effort. Do you think that there is benefit in getting a lot of people around the table and just having another conversation and saying, look, how are we working? How could we approach this? And maybe refreshing some ideas, making sure people are joined up, maybe looking at the things that we've touched on around, well, let's actually invest in some real diversion that's available. Do you think there's benefit in doing that?
Well, I've been around for the last 20 years. I try to be optimistic about, you know, community meetings, strategies. You know, we've probably done it all over the time frame. I think that it's important for us to education. It comes back down to education. Where are we right now? For real, for real. What is happening with those families who are left to pick up the pieces.
Yeah.
And how do we look at the reality of where we are now? Because they're your first group. You know, I look at the over 60 plus children that we service, and my goal is to stay connected so that if the person who's been prosecuted for the crime's child and the victim's child are going to be starting at Berkeley, I'm letting Berkeley know, listen, you need to prepare.
Yeah.
You know, someone has to know the information. Someone has to be able to do the preventative piece. The meetings are only fruitful if we have a plan, a real tangible plan. I am yet to see either of our governments. They've both had their opportunity to me to come in and do something drastically different.
I think, I mean, and it's not being, but certainly the direction that government wants to go, and conversations I've had with the minister are very much in line with what you want. I mean, my own view is it is healthy and right to get people regularly around the table and talk about stuff, but equally, talking's great, action's better.
Sure.
And the point when you say about a plan, and I saw in the Gazette this morning Mr. Crockwell talking, I think it was about perhaps 400 people at risk of gang violence. But if you actually boil that down to families, it's not a huge number. And if you can get those families and you get some ownership and say, well, okay, what team needs to work around that family? Is it education? Is it police? Is it voluntary services? Is it youth intervention and so on? Let's get some ownership and let's keep coming back and talking about how that family's going. Because at the heart of a lot of problems is some real basic stuff. It's like how the family's parented, the support that they get, perhaps the finance that they face, and what can be done to assist that, the education. And I think if you get a plan in place, you get ownership, and you really focus on some of the things, and you can make a difference.
But you also need bold leadership. You need a voice and a leader who is unapologetic. I find that we tippy-toe. We don't want to hurt this group, or we don't want to go against that group. We want to make sure the churches is okay. No, like at the end of the day, you know, I look at a place like 42nd Street in New York, which was notorious at one point, as you would know. It was just this street that had prostitution and drugs and all of them. A bold leader stepped in and said, you know what? We're going to bring change to this community and let the chips fall wherever they like. We're putting the resources, we're putting the plan, and we're bringing the people together to.
But your description, because often what's mentioned to me, I think it's things like clean sweep and everything, zero tolerance. That's a top-down approach.
Yeah.
As soon as I turn that off, it all comes back. What you're describing, which is what support is, you grow it from the community, upwards.
Yeah. And there have been, like I said, there have been people in the trenches throughout this whole process. We've learned some painful lessons as people on the front line, you know. Education, training, you know, helping people to understand the best approach to, even sometimes when people are trying to help a person. You know, in our training, I mean, as a grief recovery specialist, people think it's best to just hold them and hug them and tell them everything's going to be all right. Sometimes you have to let that person scream, shout, kick, and release so that they can get to a point of being normal.
Yeah.
So it's those sorts of things to me that we really need to focus on. I am very concerned about the 400 children at risk. And I'm concerned about it because, you know, I was a former senator. And when I was sitting in the chamber, there were 9 children at risk.
Yeah.
And so those numbers have quadrupled and doubled. And when I look at the children that we serve, for every one child, like we actually serve the child of the deceased. So if that individual has 1 daughter, 1 son, or 3 children, that's who we're servicing. But you can add at least 2 or 3 other children to that one person's life because he has godchildren, he has siblings, he may be a part of a football team. So when you really look at the numbers of children being affected, you know, if this person's been a consistent.
But the one of the things I raise with you, and it is actually gives you an indication of focusing on certain families, is I've got police officers here that have arrested a grandfather, a father, and a son. So 3 generations of the family, because it will, particularly if you've got that kind of criminal element in a family, it's more likely than not that the child growing up in that environment is going to go that same route. So how do you break that cycle?
Yeah. Well, again, I think that you have to. It all comes down to trust. We're able to go into environments and talk with guys and families. I think one of the reasons why I'm able to go in, I come from the area. I'm born and bred. People know that. I have no qualms about my own challenges in my own family. I have a brother who's been in and out of prison all of his life. I don't have a problem with having that honest, open conversation because it's the truth. I know what it's like when you're trying to give the person another chance and you're saying, okay, this time you're not going to go back and steal from mama. It's real. People can relate to you when you're able to be honest with them. At the same time, they see change. They see how when we rattled around my brother and we took a stand against when he was ready to get the help, that is a changed man today. So to me, and there are many people out there whose family members have been on the wrong side of the law and who have made changes. I think there's sort of testimony stories and examples prove that with the right support, resources, and help, it can be done. I really, really do. But I think we have moved away from a lot of those authentic things that made us Bermudian. Those things where guys would just come and get you. Your friends are not going to let you get in a car and they know you're incapable. So a lot of those things are things that we need to sort of get back to. But I do believe, everything has a dollar attached to it. Everything. You need money, you need resources, and you need a plan that people can buy into and see, okay, it might not happen in 5 years, but if we carry this plan out, we may begin to see some change. But where is the plan? Where is the leadership? I've done this purposely. Every time there's a shooting murder, I copy and paste the press statement from every premier that has sat in that house. And they all say the same thing.
For me, and maybe wrapping up, I look forward to working with you and having dialogue and doing some practical issues. Certainly from my side and the leadership I can offer and working with the Minister's office, I think it's right that we go forward to keep conversation, start looking at different ways and talk about perhaps some more difficult dollar issues. And I appreciate the work you do, but equally from the BPS's point of view, we want to listen and understand community needs, and we want to be a part of the community and have some trust, gain some trust from them, so we've got confidence that when they contact us, so we're not just simply fighting crime, actually we're working very closely with people and looking after them.
Sure. And I do believe that, the dialogue is important. A lot has changed from the very first shooting to now. There are some great opportunities, some great synergies. I think silos do us no good, working in isolation. It never has and it never will. I do believe that sometimes it's timing too. Someone asked me, what is it going to take to have a different approach after, 35, 40 plus murders? Yeah. Meaning, will it change if an innocent child gets shot, or a senior citizen, or someone we deem, it shouldn't happen to? Will something change if one of our leaders, someone again that we deem as important, what would be the approach? How would they deal with that? Would it be how we've seen it over the last few years, or would Scotland Yard show up, curfews be put into place, and people, a different approach? Would that happen? I don't know. My prayer is that we never have to get to the place or the day where a senior citizen, an innocent child, or someone that we believe is not involved in the activity but could be an innocent bystander loses their life, and then we say, okay, now we have to do A, B, C, and D. We still have opportunity. We still have time. There are many great workers and organizations already in the trenches. I believe that just the beginning of this dialogue, between yourself and persons like myself and others, if we're honest, we can't come to this table with agendas. We can't come to this table, expecting one person or the other person to do it. We working together means it means what it says. You know, it can be a big thrust and then a year later the program doesn't exist anymore. It has to be sustainable. It has to be something that, and that will prove to people that we're serious. You know, one thing about the street, guys are willing to take a bullet. They are willing to die for each other.
The reality of when people start believing it is when you're a senior and you lean out your front door and you don't hear gunshot sound.
That's right.
Or you're not afraid because somebody's graffitiing your wall and you're too afraid to tell the police about it. I think that's the reality.